We'll go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to the EnergyCAP webinar series, and we thank you for joining us today. I'm S.J. Bergman, and I've got John Pierce with me. John's going to be answering any questions and adding additional insight into this discussion of groups and benchmarking. So this is part of a webinar series that we've been hosting over the last few months to introduce you to some additional capabilities of the EnergyCAP software. So at this point, all attendees are muted, but you can type your questions into the questions panel on the webinar interface, and John will answer your questions. And if we have time at the end of this webinar, we'll discuss some of those questions and share them with the entire audience. So before we get started, I'd like to refer you again to the web page that we have set up for SUNY. This is what you're seeing on your screen now. The address for this is www.energycap.com/SUNY. And this is where you can find the webinar schedule and the registration links. You probably registered here. But after each webinar, we do post a link to the recording of the webinar on this page also. There's also other information, including information on upcoming webinars that we have planned for you to, again, help you to learn more about EnergyCAP and to get the most out of your software. So let's get started on our topic of the day, which is groups and benchmarking. So now that you've all been diligently entering your utility bills into EnergyCAP, and you probably have a good 6 months or so of data. So this is a good time to start some data analysis. EnergyCAP has provided a number of ways to make the best use of your utility data, and so groups and benchmarking is one of the ones that we really are excited about and we're going to be talking about in the webinar today. So why should you benchmark your buildings? Well, it gives you a starting point. So if you know what you're doing today, that can help you to determine where you want to, what kind of goals you want to set, and where you want to be in the future as far as your energy performance. Benchmarking also can help you to identify outliers, and that means both good and poor performance. You can identify those buildings that are performing really well and possibly determine what they're doing and use that as a starting point for setting up best practices for your other buildings. And of course, we always think about looking at the very poor performers also and using that as a place to focus your limited energy efficiency improvement dollars. So you want to focus your dollars on where they're going to have the greatest impact. So that's really the purpose of benchmarking. So what is benchmarking? So when we talk about energy benchmarking, it's the process of collecting, analyzing, and relating energy performance data of comparable activities with the purpose of evaluating and comparing the performance between or within entities. So we're talking about making a comparison. So we're going to in EnergyCAP, we're going to be comparing the energy use, consumption, and energy costs, but the key is they should be similar items. And how you define similar items is really entirely up to you. It can be similar by how a building is being used. It can be similar in that they have the same utility provider. There are multiple ways that you can define this. We have some set up for you automatically in EnergyCAP, and then others you can set up yourself based on your criteria, which only you can decide how you best want to compare your buildings. So when we talk about similar entities, we are usually talking about either buildings or we're talking about meters. So those are the two similar entities that we typically benchmark in EnergyCAP. So the easiest way to explain this is by showing you an example. So let's look at your database, set up some groups, and then look at the results. So to get to the groups and benchmarking area in EnergyCAP, off of the main navigation menu, and it's between buildings and meters and accounts. So here's the groups and benchmarking tab. So you can see here that we have two types of groups. There are place groups, and that's typically meters, but it can also be, in the case of your campus, it can be campus groups. And I've created a folder here for campus groups. There are also meter groups. So we've got our basic place groups and our meter groups. The blue folders are any what we call auto groups. So an auto group is a group that EnergyCAP will set up automatically based on, in this case, for places, the primary use designation that you set up when you created the building. Now, if you chose not to include a place primary use, you can always edit that later, and I'll show you how to do that. So the place groups are probably going to be the most useful for you once you get into the phase 2 implementation of your EnergyCAP software. Already there is a category set up here for your Executive Order 88 buildings. So this would be a group that could include any buildings that have to be reported under the executive order. Currently, I think that is empty. Yes, it's empty now, but that's something that I would anticipate in the future that you would definitely want to work with. So one of the things that we've done in the initial setup of the buildings area of the database is to include some of these place primary uses. So this is customizable. So for example, we added animal barn just for the SUNY system. That's not a standard EnergyCAP designation, but you do have animal barns on a number of your campuses, so we did include that as a property. That was a custom term, and there are 19 members in that animal barn group. And you can see there are a number of other designations that you can set for primary use. And this has nothing to do with Energy Star or Portfolio Manager or anything like that. This is purely a way for you to compare your building. And this is the auto assignment, but you can make your custom groups, as I already said, under the yellow folders. You can create custom groups. So why don't I show you now how to go ahead and do some edits. So in this area, for example, we'll go back to the animal barn. So if, for example, you have a campus, this is going to be in, typically you've been working in the purchase utilities section, but these are going to be the buildings that are already populated in the building commodities section of the database. So if we pick, for example, probably Alfred Tech probably has in there something that could be a animal barn. Let's look here at the dry cow housing. So if we select that building and we go to the building properties, then we can see here that this is all the information about this particular building. There isn't any bill data in this area now because this isn't being used, but this is how you would assign a primary use. So we see here that already there's a primary use assigned of animal barn. But let's say that this really isn't an animal barn, that the folks at Alfred State look at this and say, well, this isn't an animal barn, this is something we actually use as a classroom. So you can select the pencil down here at the bottom where you can edit the building, select that, and then you have a choice over here to check the primary uses. So we could say, well, this really isn't an animal barn, we're really going to change it to a classroom instruction. So you could select that, or if you decide that, well, it really doesn't fall into any of the designations that I see here, if you select the plus, then you have the opportunity to create a new primary use group. And you can do this at any point. The one thing I would caution is if you create a new place type, but there are no other buildings that really fall into that primary use, then you won't have anything to compare that building with. So be a little bit careful about setting up new primary uses. I think we've set up quite a few, so if you can find something that's similar that'll work for you, that's probably the best approach. But you can set up a new one if you decide that that's important for you. Okay, so that's how you can either edit or add a primary use to your buildings. And again, that's in the building commodities area of the database. Okay, so we're going to go back to our groups and benchmarking again. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about how even in phase one, we can definitely use groups and benchmarking to compare places. And in this case, I've created a custom group in this test database. This is not your production database. This is a test database, but we can certainly set up the same thing in your production database if this is something that is useful to you. So I created something called campus groups, and under that I created campuses. And if we look at the group properties, there are actually 52 members of these campuses. So what I did was I went into the purchase utilities area, which is where you're entering your bills, and here are all of your campuses listed. And what I did was to take the buildings that are in each campus and add them to the group. So let me show you what that looks like. So under, for example, this is one building that's in Binghamton. If you look at the building properties and you look under the groups, you'll see here that Binghamton is a member of that campus's group. If you wanted to add to another group, let's say we create another custom group that just compares Binghamton and, let's say, Albany. If you wanted to create a custom group, you could add that building to the group just by selecting this plus button, and then you'll be given the option to select the group you'd like to add it to, and all the groups that are available will show in this drop-down. So that's how you add to groups. And you can be a member of as many groups as you want. There's no limit. You can, and there's no disadvantage to be a member of many groups. So you can set up as many as makes sense for you. So what I did was, again, I created a group that had all of the buildings in it. Now there are 52 because, for example, if we look at Albany historical data is not in there, but all of the different Albany campuses are included in the group. Now there's one of these that doesn't have any data, that doesn't have any meters assigned to it, so there won't be any bill data in it. So it is still part of the group. Typically, you can make it part of the group, so let's add this to the group, but it really won't ever show up because it doesn't have any bills. So we'll add it to the group, save, and now it shows up as a member of that group. This is also hyperlinked, so a quick way to get back to that groups and benchmarking area is just to click the hyperlink, and then we get this information here. Okay, before we jump into all the information that you get from benchmarking, we need to spend a minute setting it up. So if we go down here to this little gear, it's on the bottom right-hand corner, we select that gear. And these give us the options that we want to use to set up our groups and benchmarking. These settings are user-specific. That means that the options that I set up today are going to be specific to me and to my user. If someone else who's on the webinar today goes in and changes these options, sets them up for whatever they want to see, that will stay for their user, and it won't change what I've already set up for my user. They also will, the options will stick, so whatever I set up today, the next time I log into EnergyCAP, those options will still be there. So this is kind of nice because you may have preferences about how you want to use your benchmarking, and so this way you can set it up the way that makes most sense to you. So the first thing you want to look at is your user-defined range. Groups and benchmarking is typically done on an annualized basis. So the most common range would be the last 12 months, and that's the default. So if you want to look over the last 12 months of data, you'll see the most, kind of the most recent 12 months. A lot of times, for example, for SUNY, it might be more interesting to look at the last fiscal year. Another thing that you can do is to do a user-defined range. So in this case, I have the user-defined range set as the last fiscal year. So there are some options for the kind of data that you choose. Typically, it is annualized, but you can choose, for example, to look at your billing data for a quarterly period. It doesn't have to be just the 12 months, although 12 months is kind of the standard that we use. Okay, the next item is order by highest to lowest. Typically, this is the way you want to keep this setting because you almost always want to show your worst performers, your biggest energy users. You kind of want to show those on top. But there may be cases, for example, I was saying earlier, sometimes you want to see your best performers. And in that case, you can change the setting to rank lowest to highest. But when you're first looking at benchmarking, definitely take the first look at the highest to lowest because that will give you the best picture of what you want to focus on for your energy efficiency improvements or other things that you can do. Okay, commodity filter. So sometimes you want to look at the building as a whole. This is something that is active only on the places. If you want to use your meter groups, then you won't see this commodity filter. But what this can do is you can either look at all of the commodities that are on one of these places. In this case, we're looking at campuses. Or we can limit it so that we're just looking at one commodity. You cannot pick multiple commodities to look at once. You can't look at a combination of, for example, electric and natural gas. It has to be either all of the commodities or none of the commodities. So we're going to leave that at all, just to give a good picture. Then you can limit rows. Now this is an interesting, this is kind of how you would start your benchmarking process. You would want to start with the maximum number of rows. So we know that in this particular group that we're looking at, we have 52 members. So we're going to start off at limiting the rows to 100. Now, obviously, we're not going to see 100 because there aren't 100 in there. But we want to see as much as we possibly can at first. Then, once we've seen the big picture, we'll want to start narrowing that down. So we'll start wanting to look at just a smaller subset of that larger group. So, but this is how you would start with look at a lot, and then as you see things that are interesting to you, you can narrow it down and look at more. Show excluded. We have the option to exclude places manually from this, and I'll show you this in a minute, why you might want to exclude different places. We also have the ability to say we want to look at only base load. We don't want to look at anything that's weather dependent, or we want to include weather dependent meters also. In this case, we're going to look at everything. So those are the options that I have set. And as I said, when I save those are my user options. And if you would like to use those options, you can go ahead and set those up yourself. So now this is where the fun starts. We can actually start looking at some of the results of your campuses. So these are the different options that we see. So let me make this a little easier to see. Okay. So what you're looking at here is what's called the cost per area ranking. So this rank shows you the blue bars are your annualized cost per area. Okay, so these are your costs per square foot on an annual basis. So we're looking at the last fiscal year, so fiscal year 2013. So we can see here that we have the blue bars, and this is in order of the blue bars. This is how it's organized. So the blue bars are the cost per area, and then the orange bars are the total cost for that billing period range. So what we can see when we look at this, oh, and this line here, this is the average across all of the buildings in the group. So when we look, we can see that when you get down to this mid-range, most of the buildings, most of the campuses are kind of in the same range until you get near the bottom. But there are quite a few that are in this middling range. But these at the top are definitely kind of skewing the distribution. So if we wanted to take a closer look at what's going on in the middling range ones, we might want to exclude the ones that are what we would consider to be the outliers. So we'll start here. So this is SUNY ESF, and we're going to select this to exclude it from the benchmark chart. Now, one thing I'd like you to notice is the annualized cost per area, the average is $2.96 per square foot. So when you look at this bar here, when I exclude that building, this number will not change. Okay, it's not supposed to change. Typically, the annualized cost per area includes any buildings that you can't actually see in this group. But because we're excluding them, okay, so that's going to actually change our cost per area. Now, one thing that we can see here is this is the ship. Now, a ship isn't technically a building, and it really isn't even that similar to campuses, so that probably shouldn't even be included in the group at all. So we're definitely going to exclude that. Okay, now once we do that, you can see that the rest of those campuses, you can start to see much more variability among them. So in general, when you're looking at this chart, you want to look at you're looking for areas where you have the greatest opportunity for savings. So those would be cases where you have the highest cost per area, so the blue bar is long, and also you want to make sure that there are places where the orange bar, your total energy spend, is also high, because that's going to be the greatest opportunity. Because if you have a large energy spend and a large cost per square foot, then that typically is a good opportunity for savings. So for example, this is a large energy spend, so this would be a good opportunity. This is only a small energy spend, and it's slightly above average, but it's only a small energy spend, so it may not be something that is potentially someplace you'd want to focus. So again, here we have all the way down to the lowest. And if we wanted to switch this around, we could change the order. And then we can look at it as the best performers. And if we only wanted to see, let's say we only wanted to see the top 10 best performers. Then you can really start to compare these. And although I only did include that 10, the average cost should be the same for the entire group without the excluded. If you're interested in seeing the actual data, you can click the magnifying glass and you have the opportunity to copy this chart by doing the download image, or you can get the data. And then in order to get that data, you can copy that and paste it into an Excel spreadsheet. And then you can do whatever data manipulation with that you're interested in. And then the question mark, as always, we have the question mark tab, which gives you all the information. And I'll point out here, it does say the vertical line shows the average for the entire group, which may include buildings not shown on this chart. So these are the rules as far as the bills and what bills are in that benchmarking chart. Okay. So I'm going to go back, and I'm going to go back to my highest to lowest setting. And I'm going to look at all my rows again. Then I'm going to move on to the next ranking. So the one that we were just looking at only shows cost. So we're looking at cost per square foot, and we're also looking at the total cost. So the next thing that we're interested in is the use. So the use per area rank works very much the same way. Because we're looking at all commodities, it's going to use the roll-up of MMBTUs as the common unit for all of the commodities. If you were looking at this for, let's say, just electricity, why don't we do that now? You'll see that the unit that we're using now is megawatt hours. So it will use whatever unit we have set for that commodity. So let's go back and look at all of our commodities. Okay, and once again, we can look at this. We can exclude this outlier if we choose to. And that gives us more detail. Now, some of these do have zeros in them as far as the usage, but have a cost associated with it. That could be unmetered usage, could be some other reason for that. Okay, so you're probably getting the idea of this, but the next one that we have is the demand. And in this case, in this particular chart, we've got this is only going to show, obviously, electricity, because that's the only case typically where demand is a valid measure. And in this case, the highest demand within the range of the billing periods is what is shown. So if you looked over the past fiscal year, the highest demand is what you would see here in this chart. Okay, the next chart is the cost rank. So what this does is it just takes the total cost for the period, divides it by the number of days in the period, which in this case is an annual number, and it shows the cost per day. So the blue bar is the average cost per day for that campus, and then the orange is the total cost for that billing period range. And these two are obviously, they're correlated, so you're not going to have the big difference between the blue bars and the orange bars like you have in some of the other rankings. And again, we have the same options to exclude based on what your area of interest is. And for the cost rank especially, because you can change it to a non-annualized number, you can look at whatever billing period you want. This can be an interesting chart to look at over different billing period lengths. In the same way, we've got the use rank. So the use rank is going to show, like the cost rank, it's going to show the MMBTUs per day. So taking the total use and dividing it by the number of days in that period, and then also looking at total cost. So it's use and cost together for the use rank. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is the weather-dependent use. So in this case, we have the weather load. So the blue bar is going to be any use that is weather dependent. And your orange bar is going to be your use that is considered base load. So based on the meter regression for these campuses, we've determined, EnergyCAP has done the calculation and determined that this amount of that meter use is base load, this is weather-dependent load. And so that's what you're seeing here in this particular chart. And we have that for the heating degree day sensitivity is valid for the heating season. And then we also do have cooling season, which would be the cooling degree day sensitivity. Looks like optometry uses a lot of cooling. There we go. Okay. Now, just as easily as we excluded groups for various reasons from that, we can also include them again. So we can choose one or multiple to include at a time. So in this case, I'm going to include back into our benchmarking everything except for the maritime ship, because I don't think, from my perspective, that doesn't fit in this particular group. Now, you could disagree, and you could have your group be whatever you wanted it to be. That's the nice thing about groups and benchmarking. So I'm going to re-include those, and then when we go back in here, we'll find that it's back. Let's hit reload. There we go. Okay, if you have any questions about the place groups and benchmarking, feel free to type your question into the question pane, and John will look at those questions and we'll take a look at them at the end of the session. So the next thing that we're going to look at are the meter groups. So the charts that we looked at for places work in much the same way at the meter level. So we've got our meter groups, and we can see here in this database that UB has already set up some groups that they're working on. I want to first talk about the blue folders, which are the auto groups that EnergyCAP will come up with for you. And then we'll talk about some of the custom groups that you might possibly want to set up. So first thing we'll look at is the commodity auto group. And as you might suspect, that includes meters by commodity. So when you add a meter to EnergyCAP and you have to assign a commodity to that meter, it will automatically be included in this commodity auto group. So you don't have to do anything to add your meter to this. Once you add the meter to the system, it's going to automatically show up in here. So when we look at this, we can look at all the meters of a specific commodity across all the vendors. So this is a great way to identify those energy hogs and to compare unit costs for a commodity even across the state. Let's use natural gas as an example of that. Okay, so if we look at this group, there are 637 members of the natural gas group. Okay, let's look at our settings. We'll keep those settings. That looks good. And as you might expect, when you look at the cost rank, so remember this is going to be the average cost per day is the blue bar, and then the orange bar is your total cost for that billing period range. So this is going to identify which meters are using the most natural gas. And as you might expect, your heating plants, central heating plants, and your campuses that only have one natural gas meter are typically going to be pretty high in these areas. Okay. So in this case, because there are 637 meters in this group, if you show only 100, you're obviously not going to see them all. So this is a case where you would want to look at your highest, look at your lowest, and do some slicing and dicing in there, maybe excluding the top 10 or the top 50, depending on how you're interested in seeing this information. But typically, you're going to want to focus on the top spending, the top cost per day, and again, the total cost for that billing period range. In the same way, we can look at the unit cost, which is, this is useful for commodities because you're looking at the dollars per decatherm. So I usually use as kind of my benchmark for cost for natural gas is $1 per therm. So I'd be expecting to see an average of, about $10 per decatherm. So across the system, the average is 4.7, which is pretty low. But there are a number of meters that are significantly higher than that, so that would be something that you kind of want to look into. That seems like that number is really high. It could be that there could be some reasons why. There could be a problem with not including usage data, which would definitely skew your unit cost when you're looking at cost per decatherm. But you could also have a problem with, with your data entry or some other issue like that. So I think you could probably say that in this case, all of these costs that are maybe over $100 per decatherm, I would say they're all probably outliers that may have other problems. So I would probably just exclude anything over $100 unit cost. Okay. So this would probably give you a somewhat better idea of what's actually going on in the database. And if you look at the numbers, you'll see that as we get down here to the bottom, we're down to about the $10 or $11 per decatherm, which would be in the range that I would be expecting, especially for some of these smaller ones that have a small total use, because you probably have some sort of a customer charge that might even skew your numbers a little bit higher. So that's the use per cost rank. Now we have our use rank. And that's going to show the use per day and, again, the total cost. So not surprisingly, again, you're probably going to see the central plants and the main campus meters ranking high on this chart. Okay, the next one is the unit cost by cost rank. And this typically will include the same numbers as the unit cost rank, but it's ordered by the orange bar rather than by the blue bar. So it's just a different way of looking at the same thing. And then similarly, the unit cost by use rank is the same as the use rank, but ordered by the total use bar. So you'll probably find some of these charts you like to use. You'll probably go back to them on a regular basis. Others of them you might not use at all. We've set these up based on things that our users have said that they like to see when they're doing groups and benchmarking. And some of our customers have some very elaborate setups for doing comparisons. One of the things that oftentimes cities are involved in are things like the Better Buildings program, where they take a group of buildings and they look at their performance over time. Groups and benchmarking is great for doing that kind of tracking because you can just take a set number of buildings and then you can focus on those, compare them with each other, and make some general discoveries using that data. We have some customers that will have actually hundreds of groups set up because of some of the comparisons that they're doing. They also might set them up, for example, if you have different groups that maintain different buildings. So they hold people responsible for those buildings, and then we'll kind of compare how one team does compared with another team. So there are lots of ways that you can use the groups and benchmarking, and I'm sure that if you come up with any great ideas, please pass them on to us because we like to share them with other users and get people using this because we think that groups and benchmarking is a really useful tool. Okay, so that's looking at our meters by commodity. Sometimes you're going to want to look at them by commodity, but maybe also by a specific vendor. So let's take a look here at our vendor commodity auto group. So here you can look at this list and you'll see that these are all the vendors that are listed as well as the commodities. So again, when you enter a meter into EnergyCAP, it will automatically assign meters to these by the commodity and the vendor. So let's look at something specific here. Let's see, look at something easy. These can get pretty complicated. Let's look at, how about this? This looks like an oil, a group of oil meters. Okay, there are 13 meters in here. Okay, so again, this is going to show our cost rank. And if we're looking at this, we probably want to exclude these outliers. Those were main heating plants. And then we can look at the consumption for these actual buildings. Cost rank, unit cost, use rank, unit cost by cost. You can see your unit costs are, you're pretty consistent here. There's not a huge difference between these. And then, of course, the unit cost by use rank. Okay, so that's one with only a few members, but if we were to look at, I don't know, let's look here at, let's be bold and look at NYSEG. Now, I can see that there are actually 3 NYSEG vendors listed. That's probably because when vendors are created in EnergyCAP, these groups are added, but when you are to delete a vendor, they don't get deleted here from the auto groups. And that's because sometimes historical data will include it, and there are a number of reasons for it, but if we look here, we can see this NYSEG group actually has no members. So we could go, you can't delete auto groups, but you can just ignore it because you're not going to want to, you're not interested in anything with 0 members. But this one has 110, so that's probably going to be way more interesting. So if we go ahead and look at this. So these are going to be all the NYSEG electric meters. It's going to show 100 of the 110. Average cost per day. Again, that's the per megawatt hour. Unit cost rank. I think we have a couple of outliers here. These look like these are apartments. So I think it makes sense to just exclude those. And that's going to give us something that hopefully will be meaningful. This also seems high. I'm not sure what that is. I'd have to dig into it to find some more. Okay, so use rank. Again. Now, the one thing that you'll see is because this is electric, you do also have a demand rank that's available. And again, that's going to look at the highest demand in any billing period in the billing period that we're looking at. So the highest billing period in the month, in the time period of interest that we're looking at. Okay, so that's the vendor and commodity. And that can be interesting if you're looking at what is happening to other campuses who have the same vendor and the same commodity. If you want to dig into it even more, you can use the vendor rate auto group. Okay, and so this is going to have specifically not just the vendor, but you're also going to have the specific rates for those vendors. So let's go back to NYSEG since I was looking at that before. And these are all the NYSEG rates. So we've got a lot of rates here to choose from. I guess we can just pick any. Oh, there are only 2 in here. That's not all that interesting. Now, there are only 2 meters on this, but what you're looking at when you're looking at the rate is you want to see any anomalies in the rate, in a unit cost across the rate, because typically if you have these 2 meters that are on the same rate, you kind of should have about the same unit cost. So when you're looking at, you know, there's quite a bit of difference between these 2 meters, so that might be something that you might want to look into. Let's look at another one. Hopefully we can find one that has a few more members in their group. Yeah, let's look at this one. Okay, so this looks like a natural gas. Oh, we've got 39 members in that. That looks pretty good. Okay, it looks like we've got a couple of outliers in there. So what I did was I selected that particular meter, and that will take you to that meter data. So meter properties, we can look at the actual data, and this is where you want to start digging down and looking at the, excuse me, look at the actual bills and find out if there is a particular reason why that particular meter had a high cost. So, you know, at this point I don't see anything that jumps out at me that says there's a reason why. So let's go back to the groups and benchmarking. And we'll look at the unit cost. Now this one looks strange. So let's select that meter. Now we could just exclude it, but let's select that meter, take a look at it, take a look at the bills. When we look at this list of bills, something that jumps out at me right away is that cost for this number of firms. Now, I don't know whose campus this is. You know, maybe they recognize it, but it looks like it's included in the delivery charge, and there's 40 firms, so that definitely is what, oh, it's Cortland. So Cortland, this definitely skewed something. So Cortland may know exactly what's going on with this bill. Clearly I don't, but that would be definitely something that you'd want to investigate. And just one thing to show you here, if you were to be uploading your bill images to EnergyCAP, you could select here and you could view that actual bill that's associated, the paper bill that's associated with that, and you could verify what the issue is with that bill right away. So the general concept in groups and benchmarking is start out with a large group, identify any outliers, and investigate anything you see that doesn't make sense, because it could be a data entry issue, or it could be a billing issue from the utility, or it could be an issue with, you know, let's say it could be a steam leak or a water leak or something of that nature. So this is a way for you to be able to identify outliers and make some sense out of all the data that you've been entering in EnergyCAP. So if you're thinking about starting with groups and benchmarking, I would suggest you start by creating meter groups within your campus by commodity. So you can do that creating your custom groups, and to do that you would just go to Groups and Benchmarking, and you select Meter Groups, and use the plus sign. You can create a folder for your campus, add a meter category. We're going to call that Your Campus. And then under that, you can start creating any number of groups that you want. So, natural gas. And then you can add your meters to that. Select the meter and then add it to that group. So note the rates you're under, look across the database for that rate code to ensure that you're within a reasonable range for the other campuses. If not, contact the vendor, consider changing vendors. Rate issues are something definitely to look for. We've had customers find major rate issues using Groups and Benchmarking, and some of them have been able to recover substantial sums from the vendor due to overcharging on the wrong rate. So we're out of time. So unfortunately, there's no time for any questions, but feel free to send any questions that you have to me or to John, and we'll be happy to answer them. Thank you for joining us today. So on behalf of myself and John, thank you, and we'll be talking to you again soon.